Okay, so I am wearing this hat to make a point. To make the point that the Puritans did not burn witches at the stake. They burned women. They burned women because they were afraid of things they did not understand, and they needed to attach their fear to something physical, to something tangible. And we're going to come back to the labeling. But today is Reformation Sunday. And it's a time to focus on more than a history lesson. It reminds us that life is always changing, and the church has always been changing through all of the centuries of its existence, recognizing, hopefully, the mistakes of the past, seeking to create a better future. Life just doesn't stay the same, whether we're talking about the type of transportation we use or our changing means of communication. In what is really a short amount of time, we go from storytelling to letter writing to telegraph to telephone to computers and fax machines. Anybody remember fax machines? And emails and cell phones, and things are always changing. And how we understand our faith changes too. Now, what we call the Reformation was that point in history some 500 years ago when the church went through probably its most radical changes. And that has now become a symbol of the ongoing process of rethinking, re-examining, reforming what we hold to be true and how we live out those truths each day. So Reformation is about reevaluating. Sometimes it's about deconstructing, and then reaffirming what we can reaffirm and adjusting what we need to adjust, and how we understand life and God, and how do we live each day in our time, in our place. Now, this congregation came out of the Baptist tradition, a tradition that goes back to the 1600s, when a group of English separatists, led by John Smith and Thomas Helwys, left England to settle in Holland to avoid persecution for their radical ways. You see, they were very radical. They believed in the separation of the church and state. And because they no longer fit into the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church of England, they could not stay. At that time, both of those churches were very much intertwined in their local governments. So what does faithfulness to this Reformation spirit look like? It involves a willingness to constantly examine and live our faith in new and creative ways. Because Reformation faith is always forward-looking. It's evolving rather than being static. It's focused on this world rather than a previous age or heavenly realm. And this is really what Jesus was doing every day. As he taught and as he healed people, he tried to open minds to new possibilities. He wasn't really so much trying to start a new religion as to reform the Jewish faith that he was a part of. He wanted to change the way people understood God and how people lived together. So this New Testament story that we read today is about a physical healing, but it's really about changing minds and opening up the way that we think about people and how we treat people. The story seems very straightforward. There's a blind man who hears Jesus coming down the road, and he asks for help, and Jesus heals him. But if we look more closely, there's more to it. Bartimaeus was a blind beggar. He's doing what he always does. He sits by the side of the road. He has his coat out in front of him in the hopes that people will throw some coins his way. And most likely there were other social outcasts around him, because that's just the way life is. If you are disabled, everyone assumes you've done something to deserve it, believing that God has a good reason for rejecting you. Your only hope that the more respectable citizens can make themselves feel better by giving alms. You're not really even hoping for charity, just that you'll be in the right place when they are thinking about how to take care of their own souls. So this man was labeled. He was labeled blind Bartimaeus. He was labeled a sinner and a beggar. He was labeled hopeless. This is the preconceived notion that Bartimaeus lived with along with everyone else that he knew. That's just the way the world was. But when he heard that Jesus was coming down the road, he shouted, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the people around him told him to be quiet. A great teacher doesn't have time for a beggar. Remember, you're hopeless. So just be quiet. But Bartimaeus shouted even louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And somehow he hoped that God's love did include him. He refused to be limited by his disability or the labels that were put on him. Now, it's easy for us to sit back and judge the people around him, but we so often do the same. We often define a person by some characteristic, by a label, rather than recognizing them for the multidimensional, intersectional individual, just like everyone else. Names and labels shape our observations without us even realizing it. We all like to think that we are rational people and we're in control of our every thought and action, but the truth is we are swayed by our cultural and family assumptions. Deep within the oldest part of our brain lies fears and prejudices about people who are different from us. Bartimaeus knew himself to be more than the labels that were placed on him, more than the limitations that people could see. But more than that, he was ready to get up and go wherever this hope could take him. He was ready to leave this safe spot and routine that he was in and find something new. Jesus heard his voice and said, "Call him." And the word call is used 3 times over. Jesus said to call him. And so his disciples called the blind man and said, "Get up, because he's calling you." Jesus is not simply healing one infirmity. He is calling this person into a new way of life, and he's calling the people around him into a new perspective on life. So Bartimaeus throws his cloak aside. He's not going to need to catch coins anymore. And Jesus asks him the same question that he asked his disciples back when they were arguing about who was going to be first. "What do you want me to do for you?" The disciples had asked for privilege and prestige. Bartimaeus' answer was just that I might see. And Jesus says, "Go, your faith has made you well." Jesus gave him permission to go. He could have gone home to his family, grateful for this miracle, assuming, this is just one fluke in the way the world works. The disabled are still rejected by God, and beggars still sit by the road. Now he just gets to work and give the coins to other beggars. But that's not what he did. His perspective was forever changed. He came to understand God is not punishing some and blessing others. God is calling on everyone. Rich young rulers and blind beggars and simple fishermen and rejected women are all in God's care. So Bartimaeus would learn to look beyond the labels and the differences and the disabilities and see every person as God's beloved child with amazing potential to love and give and contribute to the greater good. But this is not an easy thing to do. As we've been talking about over the last few weeks, understanding people who are different and loving your enemies, it doesn't seem to come naturally. And it isn't easy, and it is especially difficult when the people with power want to use your fears to get you to follow them. And that's where the labeling comes back in. For our Puritan ancestors, women who did not conform to the expectations were labeled witches. And I'm sure there was a lot to be afraid of back then. There was the plague, and there were other viruses, and there were bad crops, and there were cold winters, leading to hunger and more death. So labeling some strange women as evil and sacrificing a few witches would settle people's fears and hopefully keep everyone else obedient. And sadly, history has a way of repeating itself. I don't know about you, but right now I find it very hard to watch the news. And in fact, it's very hard to watch anything on any media that has commercials, because there's no way to avoid the political ads that are filled with fear-mongering and labeling. Rodney Kennedy has identified 3 dangerous labels that dominate the MAGA messages: disease, disgust, and demons. He notes that in speeches, Trump uses the disease trope on anyone who doesn't support him, and especially Democrats. Sarah Ahmed, in her book Cultural Politics of Emotion, points out that identifying people as sick and diseased leads to a feeling of disgust, and then that feeling of disgust produces those people who are disgusting, basically identifying bodies that must be ejected from the community. So in the political advertisements we are seeing now, illegal immigrants, LGBTQ community, feminists, and liberals are all sick and diseased and disgusting, which leads to demonizing and dehumanizing. David Livingston Smith, in his book Less Than Human, reminds us that thinking sets the agenda for action, and the thinking of humans as less than human paves the way for atrocities. In the 1930s, the Nazis were very explicit about the status of their victims. They were subhuman. They were vermin. And so it might be wrong to kill a person, but it is permissible to exterminate a rat. And now, the MAGA vision paints a picture of a collapsing economy, crime-ridden streets with roving gangs of violent, illegal immigrants who are coming to kill your family. This vision is false. But in the minds of those that are fearful, it feels like truth. Churches have made the mistake of choosing fear over love at many times throughout the centuries. Today, we need to be reminded that perfect love casts out fear. And this is what Reformation thinking is all about. Asking ourselves the question, do we choose to see each person, every person, as a child of God and treat them with respect? Are we following Jesus and using our time and our talents and our resources as individuals and as a congregation to contribute to the greater good for all? Now, as people who are in that tradition of believing in the separation of church and state, we don't seek to create a Christian government. We don't attach ourselves to a single political party. But we have a voice. We have a vote to share our belief that every person is precious. You can remember that the average person in Jesus' time didn't get to vote for their leaders or their laws. We have privileges they could not have dreamed of. So, as a church that honors the separation of church and state, I cannot tell you who to vote for. But I can say that when politicians talk, we need to listen. We need to listen to hear if they are concerned for all people or only some people. To listen to hear if they have any plans for bringing people together, lowering the economic inequality. Listen to hear if they care about the homeless people and desperate families fleeing violence and starvation in need of help, or are they labeling them as less than human? We need to look at what they have done to see if they mean what they say. In the words of Maya Angelou, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. And no matter what we hear around us, we have to hold on to the belief that love is stronger than fear. So this week, use your voice to vote. And now together, let us use our voices in song.